Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations to Recant Ovil Armen Sünder, which translates to "Oh, we poor sinners." This is a lengthy chorale, it's a two-pager. The second section is a little bit sparser in terms of the texture, kind of changes the harmonic rhythm, and there's more of like a contrapuntal texture going on, so picking out chords is a little bit more interpretive, I feel, in that section, rather than deliberate, as we see in the first part of the chorale, the first page. So we're just going to hop right into the analysis. Most of the harmonies straightforward, but there are some sections that have some pretty hairy chromaticism. But we have two sharps in the key signature. We start on D major, and we end here on D major. So I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is D major. Next chord we have is C sharp, E, G, and A, this D being a lower suspension, but that would make this A7 over C sharp, which is 5-6-5, and then we go right back to D major, D, E, F sharp, and A, of course, this E being a 9/8 suspension over the bass. What's interesting is that with D chords, I've been saying a lot with D minor chords, but I guess it's just with D chords in general, we see a lot of 9/8 suspensions just over D chords in particular, but in general it's something that Bach does over tonic triads and root position, and it happens to be a tonic triad that's also a D chord. But you'll find that there are situations where Bach just uses D chords and we see the 9/8 suspension over them in comparison to a lot of the other chords that we see where there's opportunity to embellish them that way. So I think that's kind of interesting. We have some passing tones in the alto and the bass here before we get F sharp, D, A, and A, which is just taking our chord and inverting it, and this D is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And we're getting ready for our first cadence as well, which is a plagal cadence. We start with G, G, D, A, and B. This is a 9/8 suspension over G major, so not over a tonic triad, but rather the subdominant. But we know that our four chords being implied. G is a chord tone, F sharp's a little neighboring seventh here, and then we get the resolved version of our our suspension chord here, our sus chord, G, D, G, and B. No need to reanalyze, and we actually have this interesting F sharp here. I wonder if that is, oh no, I'm sorry, because we're cadencing on D major. Sorry, I thought we were cadencing on G major for a second. This is a 4/3 suspension over our tonic, actually, which is kind of interesting. So on the surface it sort of looks like a plagal cadence where we're getting a 4/3 suspension over our tonic, and I guess, functionally speaking, that is what's happening, but it's kind of interesting that G and D have a tonic dominant relationship as well in terms of G major rather than D major, and it's a lot more common to see 4/3 suspensions over dominant chords. And where I don't think Bach was implying this chord to be the dominant, I think he knew about the relationship between the two chords, obviously, and maybe he's just I don't know, flipping the script a little bit, maybe not entirely, but I guess in terms of completely recontextualizing the chord, but it does flip it a little bit. So we're moving to the next phrase. We're still in the key of D major at this point. We have a perfect authentic cadence at the end of this phrase. We start the phrase off with E, D, E, and G, and even though you could analyze this as a 2/7 chord, like an E minor 7, I think this D is a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and it's this C sharp that's actually the root of this chord, even though it's very brief. This is C sharp diminished over E, because we see a pattern we see a lot in Bach's chorale writing, 1-7-6 going to 1-6, F sharp, A, E, and F sharp, a 7/6 suspension over our tonic triad this time. That's pretty cool. And that takes us to G, B, D, and E. I think that in this case, the D is actually a chord tone, and this C sharp is a passing tone here, even though there's kind of some imitation going on in between the alto and the tenor here. I think this is a 2-6-5 because it's setting up for a 2-5-1 cadence, whereas here it makes a little bit more sense that the 7/6 resolves to the 1. So it's interesting how Bach is playing with the chord, serving two roles, or maybe they're serving the same role, and just my interpretation is that the context is different between the two of them. Either way, it's interesting to see the imitation, or quasi-imitation between the two voices. 2-6-5 takes us to A major, A, C sharp, and E. It's our 5 chord. little passing seventh here, which actually takes our chord and briefly puts it into root position with the seventh. It's entirely intact, which is pretty cool, so I'll mark that. And then we cadence on D major, D, F sharp, A, and D. Next phrase ends in the key of E minor. It's an imperfect authentic cadence. It's kind of interesting how Bach gets there. We have D, F sharp, D, and A to start the phrase off. No need to reanalyze. We then have A, E, C sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord, A major, passing tones in the bass, and the alto before we get C sharp, A, E, and A, which is just taking our 5 chord and inverting it. A is a chord tone, G is a passing seventh, C sharp is a chord tone, and A is of course a chord tone. It's kind of like a 5-7 chord happening here, but it's not entirely voiced, so I'm not going to put it on the page. We then have D, F sharp, D, and A, which is our tonic triad here. And we have D sharp after this sort of C sharp pivot here. I think D is sort of functioning as our gateway chord to the key of E minor. It's really one of two things happening here, and I think it just depends on, like where in my analytical journey you would have asked me in terms of where the modulation occurs. I think it's valid to mark the modulation after the tonicization of the secondary dominant, the tonicization of the E minor chord via the secondary dominant, but I think that in this case I think D is operating as our gateway chord, and it's just turning into the 7 of the chord, and I think really what's being highlighted here is the subtonic 7th against the leading tone 7th. So after this neighboring 7th here, we have D sharp, F sharp, F sharp, and B. That'd be 5-6, B major over D sharp. E is a non-chord tone, E is a non-chord tone, G is a non-chord tone, and with that B right there, that is our tonic triad in root position happening on the end of the beat. E then turns into a lower suspension underneath the alto, usually, so the alto probably it's a 9-10 suspension. We have D sharp, B, F sharp, and B, which is another 5-6 chord, B major over D sharp, and then we cadence on E minor, E, B, E, and G. It's interesting how Bach takes the tonic and turns it into the subtonic 7th of the supertonic, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, I mean, Bach does it with quite a bit of regularity, so I don't think it's like a rarity anymore. Bach does it really all the time, and I think the pattern of 7 going to 5 is pretty common in this context as well. But afterwards, we're going to see movement to the key of A minor. Sorry, I'm just moving some of my notes off frame because my hand is colliding with them, and it's making it hard for me to write. But I think we are moving to the key of A minor, and we move to the key of A minor using a kind of interesting device. And what happens here is with the D natural, sorry, my printer, I think I need to align my printer head because it's kind of hard to make out what accidental this is. This is a D natural, but we do have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor at the end. And I think what's particularly interesting about this is sort of how Bach modulates. We have E, E, G natural, and B. So that's another E minor chord, which I also think is our minor dominant in the key of A minor. There's really not a super elegant or flowy way to modulate, to analyze this modulation. We have a passing 7th in the bass, and then we have C natural, E, G sharp, and B. And what I think is happening here is something that Bach does with quite a bit of frequency, is that this C right here does look like it is spelling a C sharp augmented 7 chord here, but I don't think this, or sorry, C augmented 7th, it was the G sharp that was on my mind when I said that, but I think the C natural is actually an accented non-chord tone, and the B is the root of this chord, where 5 is turning into 5, 6, 4. And the only difference between these two chords is the fact that we have G natural going to G sharp going to A. Usually when we see 5 turn into 5, 6, 4 with this passing these passing tones, this stepwise motion in the bass, it's usually similar triadic qualities, but it just so happens that E happens to be minor here because there's chromaticism in the alto, and there actually is quite a bit of chromaticism in this chorale. You can see it in the bass here, you'll see it in the bass line in the second half of the chorale as well. But yeah, I think this is just an interesting case of 5 changing from minor to major here because G natural and G sharp are a half step apart in this alto line. but it does resolve to A minor afterwards. A, E, A, and C. I think it's just interesting that Bach uses the minor dominant to modulate here, in my opinion. I think there are other ways that you could analyze this as well. You could say that E right here is the point in which we modulate, but I don't really see why you would mark the modulation earlier rather than later. If you see the same chord twice, what makes the first one any more of a reason to modulate than the later one? That's just my opinion. One takes us off of the beat to F and A. A is a chord tone, but this briefly takes us to F major in root position, which is our 6th chord, and it's common to see 6 chords in close proximity, at least to the cadence, because it is it establishes that sort of cycle of falling fifths relationship between the chords. We have D, F natural, A, and B, which is B minor 7 flat 5. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. We have E, we have G sharp carried from earlier in the measure, and B, which is a 5 chord, E major in root position. So a subdivided perfect authentic cadence, but a perfect authentic cadence nonetheless. And that takes us to A major, A, C sharp, E, and A. It's interesting that he goes from D major to A minor. He does so through E minor, which makes sense because Bach, at least generally speaking, he will connect keys that are otherwise distant in terms of their relationship. So this is almost, we're cadencing in the key of the minor dominant when the overall tonic of the piece is D major, but he cadences on A major. So this idea of parallel major and minor sort of operating in close proximity to one another is pretty interesting as well. But as you would expect, cadencing in the key of the minor dominant with that Picardy third at the final chord in the cadence, we're probably moving to the key of D major. That's exactly what we're doing for the next phrase. But the cadence is kind of interesting. It has plagal qualities. It also has imperfect authentic cadence qualities, and we'll talk about it. We've seen a cadence like this in the past before, and yeah, I think it's a bit of a toss-up here. So A, I do believe, is also operating as our 5 chord in the key of D major. It then takes us to D major. We have, I wrote this down actually, so I don't have to count as long. I watched yesterday's video and I had a count for a really long time, and now I am talking about it, taking away from that time I was talking about. We have D, D, F sharp, and A. I wrote them down from just on my notes so I knew what they were, so I didn't have to seem like I was counting as much. Anywho, I'm going to start doing that for my videos so it looks a little bit more of a fluid transition between systems. So that's our tonic triad in the key of D, passing tone in the bass. We then have F sharp, D, F sharp, and A, which is just taking our tonic triad and inverting it. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. We have G, we have C sharp, we have E, and we have A, which is a 5-4-2 chord, A7 over G, and we would expect that to go to 1-6, which it does. F sharp, D, F sharp, and A. So the 4-2 chord does resolve the way we would expect. E is a passing tone, E is a passing tone, G is a passing tone. It's almost like a bit of a 5-4-3 chord, but we don't have a third in the chord, so the fact that it happens off of the harmonic rhythm means it's not going to make it onto the page, but it's nice to talk about. We then have D, F sharp, A, and A, and you might be tempted to call this a tonic triad, but if you've seen my videos in the past, you know that this C natural is definitely implying something different, even though it's being paired up with an E here for some movement. So you can see the tenor and the bass have thematically been paired with one another in this measure right here. But this C natural, I think, is implying that D is operating not just as our tonic, but as 5 of 4. The C natural wants to resolve down to B, which turns into the third of a G major chord. B, D, A, and D. This A is a 7-6 suspension, but we do get the resolution on the next beat after the neighbor tones, and we even continue the C natural into the next beat. There's like a vocal swap almost, or at least a pitch swap. Oh no, never mind, it's not a pitch swap because this is an E. Bach is just moving along in thirds here. But after these neighbor tones here, we have B, D, G, and D, which is our 4 chord in first inversion after the resolution of the suspension. And then we cadence on our tonic, D, D, F sharp, and A. Now we saw a plagal cadence at the beginning of the chorale with 4 going to 1, So what makes this different? The fact that we have a 4/6 chord with the connected leading tone. This is a really interesting situation for me, at least, because when we see 4/6 in this ascending configuration, 4/6 going to 1 upwards, Bach will pretty much always include the leading tone to connect the two chords, because it goes 6/7/1 in the bass. Now Bach has found himself in a situation where he has a cadence and he's connecting the 4 chord to the 1 chord, but he isn't just skipping. There's only been one chorale that I've seen that has had a 4/6 chord go to a 1 chord without the connector here. And the connector does add a bit of an imperfect, authentic cadence vibe to the harmony, namely because of the fact that the C sharp here is the leading tone, and even though it's not entirely harmonized, it does create a sense of dominance and resolution of that dominance. So I don't know exactly whether this is a plagal cadence by the book or if this is an imperfect authentic cadence. I'd be curious about your opinion, if you have one, about this particular chorale, or this particular cadence, and this particular chorale, even if you have opinions that aren't about anything that I've talked about so far. But the C sharp as a passing tone in between the 6, the 7, and then the tonic of the scale. I don't know, I think it's a toss-up here. It really is a 50-50. I'm erring more on the side of this being an imperfect authentic cadence, but calling this a plagal cadence, you couldn't fault the person for doing that. But we are seeing a bit of a similarity between the first system and the second system here. We are going to go to the key of E minor, so no second, like intermediary second phrase. It's almost like the third phrase is becoming the second phrase here. If we're trying to compare the second system and the first system, we have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of E minor here at the end, and we start out with a D major chord, D, D, F sharp, and A, with a passing 7th here in the tenor, and that takes us to to E minor, G, B, E, and B, which in the key of D major is our 2/6 chord, and the key of E minor is our 1/6 chord. And I think we know we're in the process of modulating by this point, just because of the fact that we see D sharp here as well, and we know that E minor is on the horizon. So if you listen to the whole phrase and have to decide where the modulation's happening, I think by the time we see the first D sharp is a good indicator. So F sharp, A, D sharp, and B spells B7 over F sharp. That's 5-4-3, and then that takes us to E minor in root position, E, G, E, and B. It's almost like this 5-4-3 is operating kind of like a substitute for 7-6, like a D sharp diminished chord. That's what's happening in the lower voices, but the B turns it into a 5-4-3 chord. So it's also not uncommon to see 5-4-3 in place of 1-6, just like how we saw, or sorry, 7-6, just like we saw here, 1-7-6, 1-6, 1-6, 5-4-3, 1. It's almost an identical progression, just the retrograde. And then we have a passing 7th here in the bass before we get ascending chromaticism in the bass. We have C natural, G, E, and A, which is A minor 7 over C, that's 4-6-5, and then this passing C sharp here with the F sharp and the E turns the chord briefly into major. It's almost like we have a morphing of the chromatic scale and the melodic minor scale. I guess the melodic minor scale is, derivable from the chromatic scale, so I think that that's ultimately what's happening. But I think knowing that Bach writes mostly using, the diatonic scales that we're used to, the major and the minor, it makes sense that we just sort of have this blending of E minor and E melodic minor, or like even E major at the end here. So this is a 4-6 happening off of the beat. We then have a D natural, F sharp, D natural, and A, which is D major, just in root position. That's a 7 chord. And I think it's interesting that Bach used a 7 rather than 5 here, because typically 4 wants to resolve to 7. And if we break up the chord progression into the offbeat and on the harmonic rhythm progressions, we have 4-6-5 minor going to 7, which would be like the diatonic minor or natural minor scale, and then we have 4-6 and a major going to 7-7 fully diminished, which is a typical resolution of a 4-6 chord in the context of melodic minor. So it's interesting that there are the two chordal pairings here. This is D, fully diminished 7th, D sharp, F sharp, A and C. And that takes us to E minor, E, G, B, and G, imperfect authentic cadence. Okay, next phrase is very interesting as well. It's hard to know exactly what's going on here. My intuition tells me this is a half cadence in the key of E minor, but we also go to the key of D major just to get back to the key of E minor, meaning that there is what I've been calling mid-phrase modulation in this chorale, which is when we typically expect a chorale to modulate, the phrase will end in the key that gets modulated to. Like this, for example, we see one modulation throughout the phrase ends in the key that we modulate to. This phrase is going to modulate to the key of D major, but we're going to end in the key of E minor, so I call that a mid-phrase modulation, and it's not super uncommon for Bach to do that, but it's less common than it is something that we see. So this E minor chord, I'm going to call it 2 in the key of D major, and that takes us to A major over C sharp, E, E, and A, which is 5, 6. A is a chord tone, G is our 7th, C sharp is also a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, and that takes us not to E minor, but to to D major, but to B minor, B, F sharp, D, and A. That's a 6, 7 chord, so a bit of a deceptive progression here. We then have C sharp, E, E, and A, which is just taking our chord, it's just taking us back to A major over C sharp here, and that takes us to D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad, root positions. There's our resolution right there. And yeah, so we're still in the key of D major at this point, passing tone in the bass. We have A here, we have F sharp, we have D, we have F sharp, and we have A, which is just taking our tonic triad and inverting it. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Passing tone in the bass, and then we get A, D, E, and A. And this is where it gets really interesting, because we have descending chromaticism here in the tenor. It almost looks as if we have a suspension here, and I think that's ultimately how it's functioning here, is we do have a suspension, but the C sharp goes to C natural afterwards, of all places, which is really interesting. So I think what's happening here is also kind of, tantamount to what's happening in the previous phrase. We have A major that's operating as our 5 chord in the key of D, but it's also operating as our 4 chord in the key of E. But instead of turning back around and going to A major again, maybe to B major, like major 4 going to major 5, we have A, C natural, E, and A. I do think this F sharp is an accented non-chord tone. I guess you could call it a 2-4-3 chord if that F sharp were in fact the root of the chord, but I do think A is still the root here just because of what's happening in the bass. It seems like the root is moving twice, so we just have major and minor going on here, which is really interesting. And then we have B major, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp. This E and this C sharp are both enclosures around the D sharp, which is the third of our our B major chord. B and D, I get confused. Last phrase of the first half of the chorale section, I guess, in comparison to like the contrapuntal section we have at the end, which is also a chorale, but definitely more loosely defined chorale, and you'll see what I mean. We have a perfect authentic cadence here in the key of D major, and I think we start off in the key of D major here. We first get our resolution to E minor after our half cadence, right? We have E, B, E, and G, which is our tonic triad here, and I think that is also our 2 chord in the key of D major, and F is a chord tone here, which briefly takes our chord and puts it in first inversion, which is something I will mark, and then we get D natural to sort of reverse the D sharps we had on the previous beat. So I think at that point we know we're in the key of D major. We have B, D, D, and F sharp, which is an interesting chord here. It's a 6 chord, so this is an example of what I've been calling a transitive progression, and if you've watched my videos you probably know what a transitive progression is, but just to reiterate, a transitive progression is a chord progression that goes against the cycle of falling fifths and instead goes up a fifth or down a fourth. Typically chords that are a fifth apart are usually going downwards. So like 6 going to 2 or 2 going to 5. But when we see 2 going to 6, it's an interesting situation, for me at least, because my relationship with harmony was one based on the fact that falling fifths were the way that you got from tonic to tonic when scaffolding the scale downwards. But especially in middle chords, like chords that find themselves somewhere in the middle length of the cycle of falling fifths, Bach uses that same voice leading to go from one direction in the opposite direction. So the 6th chord here has a passing 7th in the bass, and this D is repetitive. For the next chord, we have a bit of a contrapuntal situation here. I think there are a couple of ways we can interpret what's happening here. We have G, B, B, and E, which would be 2, 6, and I think that that's what makes the most sense. E minor over G. We know that Bach loves 2-6 chords, especially in cadential contexts. Usually they're 6-5 chords, and I think this C sharp here is what really is happening here. Is this C sharp is being prepared as a bit of a suspension going into the next beat. It's kind of hard rhythmically to see what's going on here, but C sharp is also operating as the third of the chord here. A, E, C sharp, and E, and we get some anticipation. We get an anticipation in the melody. A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. D is gonna end up leaping down here in the alto. But what's also happening here, and a way that you could analyze this, is if you look at the C sharp as the root of this chord, this could be a 7-4-3 chord, C sharp minor 7 flat 5 over G, or C sharp diminished over E. I think all in all, it's just counterpoint, and the C sharp is being used as a bit of like a central tone between this B and this D here, but harmonically speaking, I think this is just, in the grander scheme of things, a 2-5-1 progression. D, F sharp, A, and D. Just D major, or tonic triad. So moving on to the second page, just going to reorganize my notes here before we get started. Thank you all so much for the support by watching this video. It really means the world to me. We are nearing the end of the journey, which is kind of scary for me because I do have some plans for what I want to do in the future of this channel, but I'm a little nervous to change the format of the videos. But regardless, here we have just a brief note here. I know this is kind of distracting. This got formatted incorrectly. There's always a typo that goes through at least one of them in these longer form chorales. This is E sharp rather than F natural. So what's kind of interesting about this next phrase is that we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor, but similar to the cadence in A minor we saw earlier, we're cadencing on that picardy third as the minor dominant turns into basically the dominant that takes us back to the key of D major. So we have D major at the start here, which is our tonic triad. And because this is a new page, I could have left it blank because our previous chord was a tonic triad, but it's a new page. I'm going to reiterate it. Same way that if it's a new system, I'm going to reiterate it. It looks awkward when you leave a blank spot at the beginning of a new system especially. But I think this is our gateway chord to the key of A minor, similar to how our gateway chord to the key of E minor here was our 4 chord. We then have G sharp, D, F natural, and B, which is G sharp fully diminished 7th in root position. That's a 7-7 chord. I think this C natural and this E here are both non-chord tones. I think that you could make the argument this is a, like a 5-6 chord maybe, but like I said about this section in particular, the harmonic rhythm definitely slows down, and it's kind of hard to discern what exactly the harmonic rhythm is when the bass is as slow as it is here. When are chords actually changing? When is a new chord actually being injected into the harmony? I think all in all it doesn't make a tremendous difference, but I think the big picture here is we have a 4-7-1 progression. A, E, and C natural. Tonic triad, root position. F natural is a non-chord tone. G is a passing 7th. G is a passing 7th. A, F, A. And C is F major in first inversion, so I guess technically maybe there is a 6-6 chord going on here. And then we have B, E, G, and C. I think this is kind of an interesting chord. I think this B is a bit of a false start. It's one of those chords where instead of it being a 4-2 chord, which I don't think it is, you could literally interpret it as a 4-2 chord and call this an unusual resolution, but I think B is just an accented non-chord tone here, an accented 7th, and really it's just like a big 3 chord here, and maybe there's some transitive harmony, but I think the big picture here is that this is a 6 chord, and that maybe in the same way that these are passing tones, these are also both passing tones. But I guess in the grander scheme of things, C is also a chord tone, so I won't leave it out. But yeah, I think the big picture, like I said, is 6 going to 2 here, B, D, G, and A, which if you take out the G as the suspension here, that we have a D, D, F, and A, which kind of makes the chord look like a 4 chord here, but I think the big picture is that the G resolves to F natural, and the bass goes from D to B, so it's not one of those cases where the bass changes and it's just an inversion of the same chord. It's an entirely different chord. We have B, we have D, F, and A, which is a root position B minor 7 flat 5 chord, and that takes us to E, 7, E, D, E, and C sharp. Sorry, G sharp. C is a passing tone, B is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, and then we cadence on A major, A, C sharp, E, and A, which is our tonic in root position, and it's major because Bach is creating the transition to the key of D major, which is happening right afterwards. But what's kind of interesting is the fact that Bach is going to pivot right back to the key of A major pretty much just 2 measures later, which don't really feel as long as the other measures do, just because there's less harmonic activity going on. But regardless, we have some chromaticism going on in the bass too, which is pretty exciting. We start off with A major here being the 5 chord in the key of D major. We then have B, F sharp, B, and D, which is our 6 chord, B minor. E is a little neighbor tone here, F sharp is a chord tone, and then we get G, which I think is also operating as a non-chord tone. And like I said, the harmonic rhythm is kind of hard to discern in this particular section because the bass is moving really slowly. Where are new chords being injected? I don't really know. I think that it's really just mostly a contrapuntal section where the rhythm is much slower than what we're expecting to see in a chorale setting. We then have C sharp, E, A, and E, which is our 5 chord in first inversion, A major over C sharp. G is a passing 7th. We then have D, F sharp, A, and A, which sort of fulfills the D major idea that was started off with this A major chord. And right out the gate, we change from the key of D major right back to the key of A major. We have G sharps going on from this point forward, and I think it's hard to ignore that. So we have G sharp in passing here. D is also operating as our 4 chord, let's not forget that. And then we have D sharp here. So what D sharp is doing here is we have D sharp, A, F sharp, and B, and I think this G sharp is also a non-chord tone. This would be B7 over D sharp. That's a 5-6-5 chord in some context, but it's probably 5-6-5 of 5 because B also happens to be the dominant of E. F sharp is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. A happens to be a chord tone as well because this is a 7th chord. And then we go to the next system, which I also wrote down, and which is really interesting, is we would expect E major, but we don't. We get C sharp minor, E, C sharp, G sharp, and C sharp, which is our 3 chord in first inversion, 3-6. And this would be an example of a secondary deceptive progression, which, if you're unfamiliar, sometimes the chord resolves not to the tonic in terms of the secondary resolution, but to the submediant. So this would, in E major terms, be 5-6-5 going to 6-6, rather than 5-6-5 of 5 going to 3. Roundabout, it's the same thing, it's just we are in the key of A major, not in the key of E major, so the Roman numerals are going to reflect A major. B is a non-chord tone, A is a non-chord tone, and then we have E sharp here. I was sitting here with this chord just wondering what was going on with F natural. No, it's E sharp, which makes a lot more sense because that creates a C sharp major chord, E sharp, G sharp, G sharp, and C sharp, which creates kind of a similar thing to what was going on here in the E minor section where we had 4-6-5 go to 4-6 here. But in this case, the functions are slightly different. C sharp major in first inversion, which is 5/6 of 6, happens to be the dominant of F sharp major, which is, or F sharp minor, also F sharp major, but I think F sharp major would be a lot less common in Bach's chorale writing, or maybe even just in his harmonic language in general. But F sharp is a neighbor tone, G sharp is a chord tone, C sharp is a chord tone, C sharp has remained a chord tone this entire time, and then we go to F sharp minor, F sharp, A, C sharp, and A, which is in this case our tonic triad, and it's our tonicized triad. Maybe that's more accurate, but it resolves not in a deceptive fashion, but in an authentic fashion. Afterwards, we have F sharp, B, D natural, and A, and I guess technically there is a little 2-4-3 chord going on there. I don't think it's super significant because we're eventually just going to go to a 2 chord anyways when we see 6, especially nearing a cadence. Even though there's no fermata here, it does sort of feel like a quasi-cadence, just because the nature of the harmony. But yeah, there is a little bit of a 2-4-3 chord there if you wanted to mark it. This E is also a passing 7th. We then have B, D, F sharp, and A. That's the 2 chord I was talking about, B minor 7. That takes us to B, D, E, and G sharp, which is, I guess, happening off of harmonic rhythm, which is interesting. So that would make this 5-4-3, E7 over B, and that takes us to A major, A, D, E, and A. 4-3 suspension over a tonic triad, which is interesting. It's also something we saw earlier in the chorale. It's not super uncommon to see that. We see Bach with these embellished cadences with the 4-3 suspension, not just over half cadences, but authentic cadences as well. I just think it's rarer in the context of an authentic cadence. And this B is another passing tone, and I think we're getting ready for the key of D major here. So we go from A major, which could be analyzed as our 5 chord, as it has operated in the past. But you know what? I am going to analyze that. I am going to analyze it as our 5 chord in the key of D major. This is a bit of a modulation zone, just because there are so many chords that are common in between the keys, or in there's so many common chords between A and D, just because they're adjacent to one another on the circle of fifths. So they're going to have a lot of chords in common with one another. But afterwards, we go to our tonic triad, and the only reason why I'm marking D here instead of D here or D here is just because A has served as a pivot point, or a excuse me, a contextual chord, or the portal chord into the new key of D major, pretty much every single time we've seen it. So I'm going to mark it there. Just because this doesn't have a fermata doesn't mean this isn't operating as a cadence. It very much feels like a cadence. The only thing that's sort of separating it from cadential status is this unique tenor line here. But we have F sharp, A, C sharp, and A. C sharp is, I think, an accented non-chord tone, and this is operating as 1-6. I guess you could analyze this as 3 as well, would make sense. We then get C sharp, A, E, and A, which is our 5 chord in first inversion. A major over C sharp. And then we get C natural here, which tells us that this D major chord isn't just a D major chord. We have a 9/8 suspension as well. D, A, D, and F sharp. I guess it's technically this C is a chord tone as well, because it happens at the same time as the resolution. So this would be a 5/7 4 chord, which is pretty cool. That doesn't always line up that way. And this C turns into a 4-3 suspension over our tonicized chord. Lots of tonicized chord, lots of 4-3 suspensions over tonics in this particular chorale, which is unique. G, B, D, and G, our 4 chord. And this A is little neighbor tone as well. And then we get G sharp here, which is kind of interesting. Some more chromaticism, why not, as we're getting ready for our perfect authentic cadence. We have G sharp, B, D, and E, which is just a substitute for 2-6-5. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. You take the third of a 2-6-5 chord and you raise it, and it turns into 5-6-5 of 5. C sharp's a little passing tone. Not really the resolution of this, there's not really a resolution going on here, even though this looks like a 5-4 suspension, which goes from a diminished fifth to a perfect fourth, which does sort of have a, suspension quality to it, even though traditionally speaking it would not look like a suspension in like what you would learn in a counterpoint class. But it's I don't know, I think underneath the hood kind of feels more suspension-like than other intervallic combinations. E is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. B is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. We then have A, E, C sharp, and E. That's our resolution to our 5-6-5 of 5. A major is our 5 chord. F sharp's a little passing tone. G is a little neighboring 7th. And then we cadence on D major. D, F sharp, A, and D. Tonic triad, root, position. Yeah, there are a couple of takeaways from this particular chorale which I do want to talk about. All of the chromaticism in the bass and the other voices as well. Really, we can't neglect the chromaticism that's been happening in the alto and the tenor as well in this chorale. Alto line here. Where's the one in the tenor line? The tenor line here with D, C sharp, C natural. We have the tonic operating as 5 of 4 quite a bit in this chorale. Nearing at the end, we have it going on here. And we have it earlier in the chorale as well with 5 of 4, which is something that I've been keeping track of. I just think it's interesting in major keys when that happens. Minor keys, it's not as interesting, but I still keep track of it. And we also have a secondary deceptive progression here with 5-6-5 of 5 going to 3. We have mid-phrase modulations. This is technically a big mid-phrase modulation, even though there's more going on under the hood. But we do have mid-phrase modulation here. Yeah, here we have mid-phrase modulation, so maybe we don't have as much as I thought we did, but we do have mid-phrase modulation in one instance, and I feel like there's something that I'm forgetting as well. Oh, we have distant modulation. We technically go from the key of D major here to the key of A minor, and even though it's happening in a new phrase, there's a common chord between the two of them, which makes me feel like there is significance there. So distant modulation, that's a big thing. But other than that, I think that's all that I wanted to talk about in this particular chorale, so I'm going to cap the video off on those thoughts. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.